Most of you have met my dad, but the woman who looks an awful lot like me sitting next to him and is here for the first time in a year is my mother. And welcome to you both to be here today. Well, my dad, Ed Meyer, grew up in Decorah, Iowa, a small, predominantly Norwegian town in the northeastern part of the state. He was the son of a Swiss immigrant and not Norwegian, not Lutheran, and not even Irish Catholic, the other big religious group in town. Immediately upon graduating from high school in 1944, Dad was drafted, but he had an exemption because he was going into the ministry, and he was an only child. Unlike Dick Cheney, Karl Rove, Rush Limbaugh, Ted Nugent, and Donald Trump, men who used every opportunity to avoid active service, Dad joined up, telling his very nervous parents that he could not imagine being a good pastor one day if he used his clergy status to avoid serving his country when members of future congregations went off to war. Dad served in the infantry from 1944 to 1946 before being shipped to the Philippines for jungle training and from there to Okinawa for the mop-up mission. He stayed on as part of the occupying force on Hokkaido until he mustered out. Once back in the States, Dad finished college in 3 years, trying to make up lost time in the military, and went to seminary at Drew University, where he became an ordained Methodist minister in 1952, married Ilse Johanna Peterson, a recent German immigrant, also attending Drew, and got his first church, St. Timothy's in Cedar Falls, Iowa. My older sister and I were born while Dad was at St. Tim's. My younger sister was born when Dad had a church in East Templeton, Massachusetts. The Methodist Church doesn't like to leave young ministers in one place very long. The Methodist Church also assumes ministers' wives will help clean the church, make sure there are flowers at the altar, supervise the nursery and Sunday school classes, arrange for coffee and cookies to be available during the fellowship hour, and run some sort of women's Bible study group, on top of taking care of the minister, the parsonage, and their children. This situation is the origin of an oft-repeated family anecdote. Apparently, one of Dad's aunts was visiting us in Cedar Falls, and as we drove past his church building, the aunt proudly asked, "Judy, what's that building?" And I answered, "That's where Mommy works." After Massachusetts, my mom decreed, in essence, no more dragging this growing family around the country, church to church. Dad went back to school and completed his master's and PhD at Harvard and Boston universities. My baby brother, who stands over 6 feet tall, was born just after Dad accepted a position as a homiletics professor at Methodist, the Methodist Theological School in Delaware, Ohio. And that's where we lived for the next 20 years. This particular Methodist seminary had some pretty radical faculty who produced some pretty radical students, both men and women, white and people of color, and not just Methodists. During those years, Dad taught, preached in the local area and in prisons, marched in the civil rights movement, and one of his students later wrote, "I came to Methodist as a naive, fundamentalist, nominal Methodist. After being radicalized by Professor Meyer, never again to bow to the evil that emerges around us, and never again to leave my brains and intellect at the church door." Almost exactly a year ago, Mom and Dad moved to Springfield to live with Bob and me, and I am honored to read some of Dad's sermons to you today. I've patched together a single sermon from parts of several sermons Dad wrote in the 1980s based on the Genesis story. And they were preached to a congregation consisting mostly of farmers. I mention this because it's easy for those of us who do not wrestle a living from the soil to talk about the sanctity of nature, happy hormone-free cows, free-range chickens, and non-GMO crops. It's hard to preach about caring for the earth to an audience of farm families, especially during the farm crisis, when one family after another in Dad's congregation was losing its farm to the church. To the bank, sorry. Grand faux pas. Losing their farms to the bank. I have cherry-picked passages that are, to me, representative of my father's message and in keeping with the beliefs of this church and this congregation. Hence, if it seems a little clunky, it's not because Dad wrote it that way, but because I didn't do a particularly good job weaving the passages together. So here goes. In the poetry of the creation story, the first thing God said was, "Let there be light." Genesis continues. He separated the light from the darkness, and he named the light day and the darkness night. Evening passed and morning came. That was the first day. So the Bible says the creation of the world began with the separation of light and darkness, with the establishment of day and night. The more I thought about this, the more I wondered, what did God really create on that first day of creation? The answer that pops immediately to mind is that God created light. But that's not until the fourth day, when God creates the sun and the other stars. How could God create light before he created the sun? What Genesis seems to describe is the rhythm of light and dark, morning and evening, first day, second day, third day, rather than the physical, astronomical entities of sun, moon, and stars. Today, if we were to rewrite these verses in a more scientific language, I think we would write, the first item on God's agenda was the creation of time. That's what all this poetic language of morning and evening, first day and second day and so on is about, isn't it? It's about time. I do not understand much about time as, quote, the fundamental structure of the universe, but I do understand two things about time as described in the Bible. First, time is a fundamental concept of life, of living. Life is time. Life passes as time passes. It makes sense that before anything else, before any matter or space, there was time. Let me explain how I understand the biblical view of time. First of all, it's a gift, perhaps more obviously so than anything else in our lives. It is a precious gift, an exclusive gift, a gift we can never give ourselves or give to others. We've created artificial flowers, artificial limbs, chemically engineered genes and gems. We have faux fur. We have cloned bacteria, fruit trees, dogs, and sheep. We can create life in test tubes, but we have not yet figured out how to create time. We may be able to prolong our individual allotment of time through healthy eating and exercise, but time itself is the gift that begins ticking away the moment we are born and continues ticking away when we are gone. Whatever we may want to do in life, whatever we may have the talent and ability to do in life, it does not matter if we don't have the time to do it. We should give thanks for time, for this hour, this day, the days we have already lived, and for the days that we have left. The second thing I know about time in the Bible is that it is sequential. It has a beginning, a first day, a second day, and according to the Bible, a last day. Time in the Bible moves toward a goal, a purpose. Some cultures believe time just goes round and round. What was will be again. In these religions, you go around once as you, and then you go around again as something or someone else, a dragonfly or a tree. But in the Bible, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. Israelites escaped slavery in Egypt because God had a purpose for them. The Israelites were not just marking time, they were living through time. Through the Red Sea, through the wilderness, through time and space to the promised land. Having life, the gift of time, means we are part of that purposeful process. The story of Jesus' life reveals why we have been given time, this gift too precious to waste. If we lose it, we cannot get it back. It's not renewable. Time only moves forward. Polluted air and water can be cleaned over time. Worn out soil can be restored in time. Clear-cut forests can be replanted, and many species return to their native haunts over time, but a lost day is lost forever. We are the only ones who can spoil or waste it, you and I. Too much time lost adds up to a lost life. When God made time on that first day when the world began, he said it was good, and it still is. Before the biblical creation story, people worshiped parts of nature: mountains, lakes, trees, the wind, waterfalls, animals, and stones. We all know the stories of how animist cultures tried to appease the god of the volcano through sacrifices, human or otherwise. But the Bible tells us God is in heaven, not in the rain or rocks or lions or eagles. Because most of us grew up in the Christian tradition, we often don't realize what a radical difference the biblical creation story made in the way people looked at the world. The notion that God started time and created the whole world, the sun, the moon, the stars, dry land and waters, the mountains and valleys, plants and animals, this was for some a revolutionary idea. I suggest that without this view, there could be no scientific study of nature. I find it ironic that fundamentalist Christians see a conflict between religion and science, because without the Genesis story, there would be no scientific approach to understanding the world. Genesis made nature natural and not supernatural. The Genesis story desanctified, demystified, secularized, and rationalized nature and our ability to understand it. St. Boniface brought Christianity to Northern Europe. As legend has it, when he found a Germanic tribe worshiping at the foot of a giant oak tree, he took an axe to it. The people, horrified, knew Boniface would surely be struck down by the god of the tree. But Boniface kept chopping and chopping until the tree fell. Then, with the fallen tree in front of them, Boniface, still live and kicking, the tribes were willing to listen to him about his God had made heaven and earth, including their sacred oak. If people worship, and I mean really worship nature, it's hard to do science. After all, you would never take your God into the laboratory and examine it under a microscope. But the creation story set humanity free to investigate nature, to cut down trees for lumber, dig into mountains for coal and iron, breed plants and animals to feed themselves more efficiently, and examine the human body to better heal it. Genesis, for good and bad, taught us that nature can be understood, used, manipulated, and often controlled. Let us remember that making nature natural is not the same as demoting it, trivializing it, or making it powerless compared to us, God's people. The Genesis story paints a picture of Mother Earth with a special place for fish and birds, water and air, respectively. Of course, Genesis was written long ago. Who could have known that we would discover microscopic spiders that live their entire lives, hatching, growing, reproducing, dying in God's upper atmosphere, in Earth's upper atmosphere, and that there would be creatures of the air, that they would be creatures of the air that are not birds, or that we could find monstrous tube worms and other strange creatures in deep sea vents, living on the chemicals erupting from submarine hot springs and not dependent on the sun. These are animals, not fishes, of the water. But Genesis is a poem, a story, and that the idea that there is a place for birds and fishes is important, not that they're creatures of the air or creatures of the water. And God made a place for animals and people, too, and they have to share it. On the sixth day, God brought forth living creatures, beasts of the earth. Earth brings forth and gives birth. It's as though from the very beginning, people would need to get along with other creatures, to walk the same ground, eat the same food, seek the same shelter. From the very start, Earth was not ours alone. Nature is God's partner, not the doll house where God put his people dolls. Instead, Earth plays an active role in the creation of life and should be treated with love and respect. God created the world and called it good. And again, this is Dad writing and speaking, I had an Aunt Edna. She was a great cook, a sort of back to basics, no frills cook. She could bake the most amazing angel food cakes that were so tall and light they rose well above the rim of the baking pan and never, ever fell. Never. Edna had a sister, my Aunt Florence, who was also a good cook. But Florence fancied herself more cosmopolitan and liked to try recipes that she cut out of magazines. One day, Florence had to supply the dessert for a bridge club luncheon, and she had Edna bake one of those signature angel food cakes. Florence took Edna's beautiful cake, tore it into little pieces, mixed it together with some sort of pudding, and poured the whole thing into a decorative bowl. I remember the end result had some sort of fancy name. When Florence left with her dessert, I asked Aunt Edna what she thought of Florence's creation. Aunt Edna turned away and said very softly, "I don't think it was necessary." Aunt Edna lived to be 90 years old, and that was the only time I ever heard her say anything that might be considered critical of another person. I don't think it was necessary. Genesis tells us the heavens are telling the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. We should not mistreat the handiwork of someone we love. The story of the fall has been read for thousands of years by Christians, Muslims, Jews, and people who don't consider themselves members of any organized religion, because it's a good story. It's a good story because it's our story, a mirror of life. John Milton called it Paradise Lost, a tragedy that reads like a fairy tale with talking snakes and magic fruit. It's a story about two places. According to the story, people once inhabited a Garden of Eden, land of our dreams, the place where we all want to retire, the place hobos sang about, Lemonade Springs where the bluebird sings and cigarettes grow on trees. Genesis said, we had it and we liked it, but we lost it. We ate the apple and got kicked out. Easy come, easy go. The other place where we ended up is the real world, where we have to work all of our lives to get by. Genesis tells us it will produce enough weeds and thorns on its own. You will have to work hard and sweat to make the soil produce food until you go back to the soil from which you were formed. In the Easter story, the storyteller tells us that the women at the empty tomb did not recognize Jesus and mistook him for a gardener. This life, this real life, is a garden, but it's a garden where we have to make choices. In mythical paradise, there were no choices. In this world, the real world, we have lots of choices, lots of decisions to make. Every day we choose between good and evil, right and wrong. It's easy to give up, to let someone else decide, especially when we see all around us the hate, arrogance, selfishness, cruelty, and war. But with the option for moral failure, there is also the option for moral victory, to celebrate our choosing love, compassion, decency, forgiveness, and self-sacrifice. Another interesting comparison of paradise and the real world is that in the real world, people eventually die. Eventually, everybody runs out of time. In Genesis, it's not clear whether or not Adam and Eve would have had eternal life had they not eaten of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But we know that in the real world, in this garden, people can make choices, but those people do not last forever. Each planting season ends in harvest. Eventually, the Genghis Khans and Hitlers, the Albert Schweitzers and Mother Teresas, they die. Perhaps death itself, the running out of time, is a safety valve for the human race. Our choices have real consequences, but as our time ends, a new time begins. And there is hope in that new time. There's hope for tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. In the last book of the Bible, John writes, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, and in the midst of the city, the tree of life, and its leaves are for the healing of the nations, and death shall be no more. Paradise is not lost. Paradise is here. We live in an Eden full of choices that we can make in our time, in our lives. Use your time to choose and choose good and then do good. Amen. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our videos. We are entirely dependent on the donations of our listeners and members. We hope that you find this content to be important enough to help us to keep offering these videos to the public at no charge by becoming a regular contributor. Please click on the donate button on our website at www.spfccc.org. Thank you for your support of progressive religious programming.